I bought this house at a foreclosure auction almost as a joke. $12,000 for a three-story Victorian that had been sitting empty for over a decade. The realtor warned me the inspection report was rough. Cracked foundation, water damage, wiring that hadn't been touched since the 70s. Everyone I showed the listing to told me I was throwing money away on a lost cause. But there was something about the place that pulled me in. Even standing in the overgrown front yard with paint peeling off every surface I could see. I remember walking through the front door for the first time, my footsteps echoing through empty rooms that hadn't heard a human voice in years. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to cast the afternoon light coming through broken shutters. I told myself I was buying it purely as an investment, something to flip in a year or two. I had absolutely no idea what I was actually about to find buried inside these walls. The house had a strange history that the realtor only mentioned in passing, almost like she didn't want to dwell on it too long. The previous owner, an elderly widower, had lived there completely alone for the last 15 years of his life, rarely leaving except for groceries. Neighbors said he used to keep every curtain in the house drawn shut, even during the day, and nobody could remember the last time anyone had actually been invited inside. After he passed, the house sat in probate for years, while distant relatives argued over what little was left of his estate. Eventually, it went to auction, unwanted and half forgotten, exactly the kind of property that usually sits untouched for another decade. I found an old newspaper clipping stuffed in a kitchen drawer during my first walkthrough, yellowed and brittle, mentioning a small house fire on the property back in the 60s. It didn't explain much, just a few sentences about damage contained to one section of the home. I remember standing there in that dusty kitchen, turning the clipping over in my hands, wondering what exactly had burned and why nobody in the neighborhood seemed to want to talk about it. The renovation work started slow, mostly clearing out decades of accumulated junk before any real construction could begin. My contractor, a guy named Frank, who'd been doing this kind of work for almost 30 years, warned me early on that old houses like this one always hide surprises behind their walls. I laughed it off at the time, assuming he meant outdated wiring or asbestos insulation, the usual headaches that come with buying something this old. We spent the first 2 weeks just hauling out furniture, moldy carpets, and boxes of belongings nobody had bothered to claim after the estate sale. It was slow, exhausting work, the kind that leaves your hands raw and your back aching by the end of every day. About 3 weeks in, Frank called me over to the second floor, standing in a narrow hallway near the back of the house, with a strange look on his face. He'd been measuring room dimensions against the original blueprints I'd pulled from county records, something he did routinely before any major structural work. He pointed at the wall in front of us, then backed down at the paper in his hands, and told me the numbers weren't adding up. According to the blueprints, the hallway we were standing in should have measured just over 12 feet from end to end. Frank pulled out his tape measure right there and walked it out slowly, calling out numbers as he went. 9 feet 4 inches. He measured it twice more, just to be sure he wasn't making some kind of mistake, but the result came back the same both times. Somewhere in that hallway, close to 3 feet of space simply wasn't accounted for. He tapped along the wall at the far end, listening carefully to the sound it made, moving inch by inch until his knuckles hit something that sounded noticeably different from the surrounding plaster. Where most of the wall gave a solid, dense thud, this one section sounded distinctly hollow, almost like tapping on a door instead of a load-bearing wall. Frank stepped back, looked at me, and said he'd seen this exact thing maybe twice before in 30 years of renovation work. Old houses sometimes had rooms that got sealed off entirely, walled over during some renovation decades earlier, forgotten by everyone except whoever originally made the decision to close them off. Standing there in that dusty hallway, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the broken heating system.
We decided to open it up the next morning, once I'd had a chance to sleep on the idea and Frank had gathered the right tools for cutting through what looked like an old lath and plaster wall. I barely slept that night, running through every possible explanation in my head, most of them far less interesting than what we actually found. Frank started cutting carefully along the edge where the hollow sound had been strongest, working slowly so we wouldn't damage anything that might be sitting just behind the surface. Dust and old plaster crumbled away in chunks as he worked, revealing wooden support beams that looked noticeably different from the rest of the house's framing, like they'd been added later by someone in a hurry. After nearly 20 minutes of careful cutting, he pulled back a section of wall roughly 3 feet wide, and both of us just stood there, staring into the dark space behind it. Cool, stale air drifted out immediately, the kind of air that hadn't circulated in decades. Frank grabbed his flashlight off the floor and pointed it into the opening, and neither of us said a single word for what felt like a very long time.
The beam of the flashlight landed first on a small wooden desk pushed against the far wall, coated in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. Behind it, shelves lined nearly every inch of the tiny hidden room, each one stacked with old cigar boxes, leather-bound notebooks, and what looked like stacks of folded documents tied together with string. The room couldn't have been more than 6 feet by 8 feet, barely large enough to stand comfortably inside, but every surface had clearly been used for something deliberate. Frank stepped back and let me go first, saying quietly that this was my house and whatever was in there belonged to me now. I climbed through the opening carefully, my shoes crunching over decades of settled dust and plaster debris on the floor. The air inside felt noticeably colder than the rest of the house, almost preserved, like stepping into a room frozen at whatever moment it had been sealed shut. My flashlight caught a calendar hanging crooked on the wall, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges, still open to a month from nearly 60 years earlier. Whoever had used this room had never come back to update it, not even once. I made my way toward the desk first, running my fingers along the edge before pulling open the top drawer. Inside were dozens of small notebooks, each one filled with tight, cramped handwriting and rows of numbers that meant nothing to me at first glance. Frank leaned through the opening behind me, careful not to put too much weight on the damaged wall, and let out a low whistle when he saw what was stacked on the shelves. One of the cigar boxes had come slightly open on its own, and even in the dim flashlight beam, I could see the unmistakable glint of gold coins packed tightly inside. I set the notebook down and reached for the box with both hands, my heart pounding as I lifted the lid the rest of the way. Dozens of coins sat nestled inside, each one wrapped individually in tissue paper that had gone brittle and yellow with age. Frank told me right away not to touch them with bare hands if I could help it, since old coins like this could be worth significantly more in untouched condition. I set the box down carefully and reached for the next one, already sensing this wasn't going to be the only surprise waiting on those shelves. There were 9 cigar boxes in total, lined up along that middle shelf, and by the time I'd opened 4 of them, I'd stopped being surprised by gold coins and started noticing something more interesting. Tucked between 2 of the boxes was a small leather pouch, heavier than it looked, cinched tight with a leather cord that had gone stiff with age. Inside were several loose stones that caught the flashlight beam in a way the coins hadn't, throwing small flashes of color across the walls of that cramped little room. Neither Frank nor I had any real way of knowing what we were looking at, whether these were valuable gemstones or simple costume pieces someone had kept for sentimental reasons. I set the pouch aside carefully next to the coins and reached for one of the leather-bound notebooks instead, hoping it might explain what any of this actually was. The handwriting inside the notebooks matched the ones from the desk, small and precise, filling page after page with what looked like dates, locations, and short notes I couldn't fully make sense of standing there in the dim light. Frank suggested we stop opening things and get everything properly documented first, worried that we might damage something valuable by handling it carelessly in the dark.
We spent the next hour photographing everything exactly where it sat before touching much else, Frank insisting this was standard practice whenever renovation work turned up something unexpected like this. Once we documented the room thoroughly, I finally sat down with one of the notebooks under better lighting we'd dragged in from the hallway, determined to actually read through the entries properly. The date started in the early 1960s and continued for almost a decade, each entry short but oddly specific, mentioning names of local businesses alongside small columns of numbers. It read less like a diary and more like a ledger, the kind someone might keep while tracking money owed or money collected, though nothing explained the actual source of it all. Frank mentioned that the previous owner had apparently worked at the local bank for most of his career, a detail he'd picked up from one of the neighbors during an earlier conversation while we were pulling permits. That single detail changed the way I looked at everything sitting on those shelves, though it still didn't fully explain why any of it had ended up hidden behind a wall instead of sitting in an actual bank vault somewhere. I kept reading, flipping through page after page, hoping something further in would finally make sense of what we'd found.
Near the back of the notebook, tucked between two pages, I found a folded newspaper clipping that had been cut out and kept deliberately, unlike the brittle one I'd found earlier in the kitchen drawer. This one was in noticeably better condition, protected all those years by being pressed flat inside the notebook rather than left loose in a drawer. It described a robbery at a local jewelry store from the mid-60s, one that had apparently never been fully solved according to the article, with a significant amount of gold and loose stones reported missing. I read it twice, then looked over at Frank, who was still going through the shelves behind me, and told him what I'd just found. He stopped what he was doing immediately and came over to read it himself, his expression shifting as he connected the same dots I had. Neither of us said the word out loud at first, but it was obvious we were both thinking the same thing sitting in that hidden room. Whatever this house's previous owner had been doing all those decades ago, it looked increasingly like it hadn't been entirely legal, and he'd chosen to seal the evidence behind a wall rather than deal with it directly.
Once we suspected what we might actually be dealing with, I made the decision to stop going through anything else on my own and called a local attorney the same afternoon before touching another single box. She listened to the whole story over the phone, sounding genuinely surprised, and told me flatly not to sell or move anything until she could come look at it in person. When she arrived the next morning, she spent nearly an hour photographing everything herself, then explained that unsolved cases involving stolen property could technically still be investigated decades later, even if everyone directly involved had long since passed away. She recommended contacting the local police department to report what we'd found, partly to protect myself legally, and partly because insurance and ownership questions around old stolen property could get complicated fast without proper documentation. I remember feeling a strange mix of emotions standing in my own kitchen that afternoon, somewhere between excitement over what we'd discovered and genuine nervousness about what it might actually mean for me legally. Frank stayed quiet through most of that conversation, clearly having seen enough over 30 years of renovation work to know that hidden discoveries like this rarely stayed simple once official paperwork got involved. By the end of the day, I'd made 2 calls I never expected to make when I bought this house, one to a lawyer and one to the police.
2 detectives showed up 3 days later, both of them noticeably more interested than I expected once they saw the actual contents of that hidden room for themselves. They spent most of the afternoon photographing everything again with their own equipment, carefully bagging the notebooks and cigar boxes as evidence while asking me detailed questions about how exactly I'd found the space in the first place. One of the older detectives mentioned that the jewelry store robbery from the newspaper clipping had actually stuck with the department for decades, apparently becoming something of a local legend among longtime officers who'd worked there long enough to remember the original case file. He explained that the store owner at the time had insurance covering only a fraction of what was actually taken, and the case had gone cold within about a year despite an active investigation. Standing in my own hallway, watching 2 detectives carry evidence bags out to their car, I kept thinking about the previous owner, the quiet widower who'd kept every curtain drawn for 15 years, and wondering what it must have been like living for decades with something like this sealed up just a few feet from where he slept every night. Before they left, one of the detectives told me it would likely take weeks, possibly months, before they could determine anything conclusive about ownership or next steps regarding what we'd found.
The weeks that followed felt strange, almost suspended, while I kept working on the renovation around a hidden room that was now technically an active part of a decades-old investigation. Frank and I sealed the opening loosely with plywood instead of finishing the wall properly, since the detectives had asked us not to alter anything further until they gave the go-ahead. I found myself thinking constantly about the previous owner during that stretch, piecing together a version of him that felt completely different from the quiet, reclusive widower the neighbors remembered. A man who worked an ordinary job at the local bank, came home to an ordinary house, and yet spent decades living just a few feet away from evidence tied to an unsolved robbery he'd apparently helped commit. I dug through the county archives one afternoon, curious whether his name appeared anywhere in old court records or investigation files from that era, but found nothing beyond basic property and employment history. Whatever had actually happened back then, he'd taken most of the real details to his grave, leaving behind only a locked room, a stack of notebooks, and questions nobody left alive could fully answer. About 5 weeks after the detectives first came through my door, I finally got the phone call I'd been waiting for. The detective who called explained that because the original robbery victim, the jewelry store owner, had passed away years earlier and the business itself had closed not long after the original theft, there was technically nobody left to file an active claim on the stolen property after all this time. Legally, this pushed everything into a strange gray area, one the department apparently didn't encounter often, involving property tied to an unsolved crime with no living victim left to reclaim it. He told me the case would formally remain open on paper, since the statute of limitations doesn't fully apply to certain property crimes in the state, but that practically speaking, there wasn't much more the department could actively pursue without a victim or living suspect to prosecute. He recommended I speak with my attorney about the actual process for claiming abandoned property found on my own land, since state law had specific procedures for situations exactly like this one. I called my attorney within the hour, and she explained that I'd likely need to go through a formal legal process involving public notice, giving any potential rightful heirs or claimants a window of time to come forward before anything could officially become mine. It felt strange, sitting in my kitchen listening to her explain timelines and legal filings, knowing that gold coins and gemstones worth an unknown amount were sitting in an evidence locker somewhere, technically unclaimed by anyone still living.
The legal process ended up taking almost 4 months from start to finish, filled with public notices published in local papers and a mandatory waiting period my attorney said existed specifically to give any potential rightful heirs a fair chance to step forward. Nobody ever did. No distant relatives, no surviving family connected to the original jewelry store, nobody claiming any legal right to what had been sitting behind that wall for nearly 60 years. During that waiting period, I had the coins and stones professionally appraised through a court-approved valuator, partly to establish an official value for the legal paperwork, and partly because I was genuinely curious what we were actually dealing with after all this time. The appraiser spent most of a full day going through everything piece by piece, testing purity on the coins and examining each stone individually under proper lighting equipment. When he finally handed me his written report, I sat in my car outside his office for a long time before I even opened it, half expecting some enormous number and half expecting something far more modest than the story in my head had built up. The total estimated value across everything in that room came out to just under $400,000 once you accounted for both the raw material value and the collectible worth of coins of that specific age and condition. Once the legal process finally cleared and everything officially became mine, I made a decision that surprised most of my friends and honestly surprised me a little too. I kept the notebooks and the calendar exactly as they were, untouched, but I sold the coins and gemstones through a reputable auction house that specialized in exactly this kind of historical find. Part of me wanted to keep everything as some strange piece of the house's history, but a bigger part of me knew that $400,000 sitting in a safety deposit box wasn't doing anyone any good compared to what it could actually accomplish in my life. The auction itself happened faster than I expected, with collectors specifically interested in coins tied to unusual historical stories bidding well above the initial appraisal value. Once everything was said and done, after taxes and auction fees, I walked away with just over $320,000, more money than I'd ever had in my life up to that point. I used a portion of it to finish the renovation properly, finally fixing the foundation issues and rewiring the entire house the way it should have been done from the very beginning. The rest went straight into savings, the kind of financial cushion I genuinely never expected a $12,000 foreclosure house to give me.
I decided to keep that little hidden room exactly as I'd found it, empty now except for the desk, the shelves, and that same crooked calendar still frozen on a month from nearly 60 years earlier. Frank thought I was a little sentimental for wanting to preserve it instead of just finishing the wall over and reclaiming the extra square footage, but something about erasing it completely felt wrong after everything that room had actually held on to for so long. I built a small hidden door instead of resealing the wall permanently, something that blends into the hallway trim but swings open if you know exactly where to press. Occasionally, when friends come over for the first time, I show them the room and watch their reaction, and it never stops being satisfying to see their faces shift from confusion to genuine disbelief. I still think about the previous owner more often than I probably should for someone I never actually met while he was alive. A man who spent 15 years alone behind drawn curtains, living quietly beside a secret most of his neighbors never once suspected existed. I'll never fully know what led him to that jewelry store robbery decades ago, or why he chose to seal the evidence away instead of dealing with it directly. But I've stopped trying to judge him for it the way I did in those first few weeks.
Living in this house now feels completely different from those first few months of renovation, back when every creak in the floor made me wonder what else might be hidden somewhere I hadn't found yet. Frank finished the rest of the structural work over the following year, and slowly the place transformed from an abandoned foreclosure nobody wanted into something I'm genuinely proud to come home to every single day. Neighbors who barely acknowledged the house when it sat empty now stop to comment on the renovation whenever I'm outside working in the yard, some of them curious enough to eventually ask about the story that had briefly made local news once the police report became public record. I've told this story more times than I can count at this point, and it never stops feeling slightly unreal, even to me, standing in the same kitchen where Frank first told me the hallway measurements weren't adding up. Sometimes, late at night, I'll walk past that small hidden door in the hallway and pause for just a second, remembering exactly how it felt reaching through that opening for the first time, completely unaware of what was waiting on the other side. $12,000 for a house everyone told me was a mistake ended up being one of the strangest, most life-changing decisions I've ever made, in ways I never could have predicted standing in that overgrown front yard on auction day.
People sometimes ask me if I regret how much of that money went straight into taxes, legal fees, and months of waiting through a process that felt slower than it probably needed to be. Honestly, I don't think about it that way anymore. Not after everything this house has actually given me, beyond just the financial windfall sitting in that hidden room. There's something strange about knowing your own home holds a piece of history most people driving past would never guess existed behind an ordinary-looking wall. I've become the kind of person now who genuinely believes almost every old house has some version of a story like this buried somewhere inside it, whether it's ever discovered or not. Most secrets like this probably stay hidden forever, sealed behind walls that get renovated over without anyone ever bothering to check the measurements twice, or torn down entirely before anyone thinks to look closer. I got lucky with a contractor who actually cared enough to double-check blueprints instead of just patching over an odd hallway measurement and moving on with the job. Every time I walk past that hidden door now, built quietly into the hallway trim, I think about how close this entire story came to never being uncovered at all.
People always ask what I actually took away from all of this, beyond the obvious financial part of the story. The truth is, buying that house taught me something I never expected to learn from a $12,000 foreclosure everyone told me to avoid. Sometimes the most valuable things in life are sitting closer than we think, hidden behind a wall we've walked past 100 times without ever noticing the measurements were slightly off. I think about that previous owner often, a man who spent decades of his life within a few feet of a secret that eventually found its way out anyway, long after he was gone. It makes me wonder how many other houses out there are holding on to something similar right now, quietly waiting behind an ordinary wall for someone curious enough or lucky enough to actually find it. For me, it started with a contractor noticing a hallway that measured 3 feet shorter than it should have. I have no idea what might be waiting behind the walls of the next house someone decides to renovate. But after everything I've been through, I'll never look at an old house the same way again.
Before you go, hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable stories just like this one. See you in the next story.